It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long...
Well, good afternoon, everybody. There was talk before, the paper before mine, about the graveyard shift. Well, I think the last talk of the day truly is the graveyard shift. And I do feel it's only fair to give you a slight warning here, that there's going to be a change in policy in the questions and answers. That you're not going to ask me questions, I'm going to go in the audience, I'm going to ask you questions at the end. So anybody who isn't paying attention, woe betide you. Now, my talk today, Readying the Rapier, the British Army in 1913. I shied away from the title Sharpening the Rapier. I like alliteration, what can I say? But it's based on a line that I always wished I had written, which of course is Basil Littlehart's famous summary of the British Army as the rapier amongst scythes, which he described in the real war in 1930. And it's a great phrase to describe the regular British Army as it stood in 1914, or particularly in 1913. It's the rapier. It's small, it's sharp. If it's wielded with skill, it's deadly. It can kill a fairly large opponent if it's driven home with purpose. But it's amongst scythes. Now, a rapier cannot possibly parry a scythe indefinitely. It's vulnerable to being destroyed by the sheer weight of its opponent's blows. And so for the rapier to defeat the scythe, whoever's wielding it has to be a swordsman of some skill and repute. It's a great phrase. Whatever you think of Basil Littlehart's writing or his role with Lloyd George, it's still a great phrase. But I've got a better phrase than the rapier amongst scythes. I would describe the British Army of 1913 as a Swiss Army knife. It's a small, multi-purpose tool that can be expected to do almost anything. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the main thrust of my talk. Why was the British Army of 1913 a Swiss Army knife? And how had it come to be this point? And was this the right thing for it? And how well prepared was it for what was about to happen? Now, to take this analogy way beyond its normal limits, a Swiss Army knife is a fairly small instrument. It can fit into your pocket. I'm not saying that the British Army could fit into your pocket, but it was certainly the smallest of the continental armies. And it's crept a little bit into popular writing to criticise the BEF of 1913 or 14 for being small. That's rather like criticising an apple for being an orange. The BEF was small for fairly good reasons, and we've already heard these reasons earlier today. In fact, given the thrust of this paper, I'm quite glad I'm going last. We've already heard about how the Navy was the most dominant factor in British defence planning, how the War Office was fairly reluctant to fund even the fairly moderate expenditure from the Territorial Force, and how it's questionable to what extent there was war enthusiasm in Britain and indeed in Europe itself. In these circumstances, there was very little prospect of the British Army being anything more than a small force. There was no point having a mass continental army, a multi-corps strength with its numbers running close to 1 million men. The Exchequer didn't want to pay for it. It seemed irrelevant to pay for it. You don't need that many men for home defence. The Territorials can provide some of that, and the Royal Navy can ensure protection from any seaborne invasion. And equally, the main role that the British Army was expected to fulfil was essentially to go where the Navy cannot. And in 1913, that was broadly defined as trouble spots around the Empire, places beyond the easy reach of the Navy. These types of campaigns, by their very nature, tended to occur on frontiers. And on frontiers, there were poor road networks, limited logistics, certainly very little in terms of rail infrastructure. There's no point sending a multi-corps army out there because it'll simply break down for want of supplies. You will not be able to move it forward. And so it suited the British Army to be small in that sense. More importantly, it suited the British government to have a small army. The actual size of the BEF, 6 divisions and a cavalry division, an overstrength cavalry division at that, really had no particular military logic to it. Major General Henry Wilson, later to be Sub-Chief of Staff in 1914, was very fond of saying that there was no problem in military science to which the answer was 6 divisions, and in that sense he was correct. The actual decision to have a 6-division army, effectively a 3-corps army, stemmed from the 1880s and had been taken largely for reasons of financial and political expediency and simply never been revised. But nevertheless, although the army certainly desired a certain degree of expansion, it was reasonably, in its own way, it was reasonably content with its small size because its duties generally involved small-scale deployments. I mentioned before that the army could be expected to go to colonial frontiers. Now, as any schoolboy knows, or any schoolgirl, the sun never set on the British Empire, certainly not in 1913. Covered whatever we may determine it as, 1/5 of the globe, or so on and so forth. Covered a variety of continents, a huge number of climates, and a large number of countries. And within those countries were large numbers of indigenous people who, for whatever reason, did not appreciate the arrival of the British flag and did not see the benefits of being brought under British rule. Quite often, British expansion was met by armed force, and it was the duty of the army to deal with any of these problems. Colonial wars broadly took 2 different forms, either expanding the edge of the empire or putting down some kind of uprising or other troublesome incident in the empire. The quintessential trouble spot, even in 1913, was the northwest frontier of India, now the modern Afghanistan-Pakistan border, a source of constant low-intensity fighting that would actually continue both through the First World War and indeed beyond. When the British Army deployed to these frontiers, deployed to these trouble spots, it could fight almost any potential opponent. The variety of opposition faced by the British Army, best encapsulated by Colonel Charles Calwell's tactical book, Small Wars, Their Principles and Practice. Small wars they might have been, but Calwell's book certainly was not small. If it fell from a shelf onto your head, there's a high risk that it would actually kill you. And this was because Calwell sought to identify all the major types of opponent that the British Army might face abroad. And they varied enormously, from the poorly armed but very highly disciplined Zulus to the religious fanatics, the Mahdists in the Sudan, to raiders, the Afridi raiders of the northwest frontier, to the fortress-based Maori in New Zealand, Burmese bandits, even the Sikh armies trained and organised in European lines. Almost any opponent you care to think of. And the British Army had to be prepared to an extent to face them all. And this meant that flexibility was essential. The British Army had found to its cost in the Boer War of 1899 to 1902 that if the army was not prepared to face the most fearsome opponents that it might run into, then it was going to come into difficulties. The main problem the British Army had in the Boer War was it was an army that had grown rather fat and lazy on easy victories over poorly armed opposition. That is a sweeping statement, and certain battalions were more prepared for the Boer War. But as a whole, the army was not prepared for the type of combat it faced in South Africa. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but essentially, the British Army ran into an opponent that was armed with modern weaponry, particularly modern rifles, the Mauser, the magazine loader, and also small amounts of the latest modern artillery. The British Army was not tactically or really conceptually prepared for this, and they ran into all kinds of difficulties, had a torrid 3 months at the start of the war before they recovered. One thing the British Army is very good at is adapting in the field, and moved on and ultimately won a victory. But that was a watershed conflict for the British. And I don't intend to reiterate what I've discussed in my book before, but it gave flexibility a new meaning. It wasn't enough just to be good enough to defeat poorly armed opponents. From that point on, from 1902 onwards, the British Army was always preparing to face the most formidable opponent it could. And by that, it meant an opponent armed with modern weaponry, to some lesser or greater degree. And essentially, as you'll see, that boiled down to 3 potential opponents. A rematch with the Boers in South Africa, a third Boer War, a clash with Russia, presumably in Afghanistan, or at least on the Indian border, or possibly a clash with Germany, somewhere in Western Europe. Now, in tactical and operational terms, preparations for these wars broadly took the same field, especially tactically. And in terms of planning, if there is one criticism we can make of the British Army, it's that in focusing on being prepared for anything, in some ways perhaps it was not actually prepared for any one of these opponents to a full extent. What I'm going to look at is less so the planning process of the British Army, although we're happy to discuss that after in Q&A, and more about how the Army thought about its future wars, thought about its tactics and thought about its operations. The accusation has been made against the BEF of 1914 that it had a small war mentality, that it was only prepared for small wars. I think that's a little unfair. In some ways, yes, it did have a small war approach, but tactically and in terms of how it was organised and its particular strength, it was also prepared to fight in a European battle, and as its performance in 1914 showed, it did this with no small ability. So I'm going to look really at a broad picture of the army from top to bottom. I'm not going to focus on particular combat arms, though I'm more than happy to field questions to that end later on. And I'm going to give you a picture of how the army was, how its colonial experiences and its small war experiences had really shaped it, and how it had given it strength, but also certain weaknesses. Now, the image of the army in the First World War is probably defined by the phrase, lions led by donkeys. And I know in saying such things in a room of such erudite individuals is likely to get me a frosty reception. I give it not as something I believe, but merely as a starting point for us. And in some ways, that view of lions led by donkeys begins right in 1914. The gentleman behind me, Sir John French, became something of a scapegoat for the Army's any setbacks the Army faced in 1914 are often laid at the door of that gentleman. And from that, various authors, Tim Travers, for example, have extrapolated backwards and said something must have been rotten with the Edwardian Army Corps, the pre-war army. I don't believe that's true. Something that really defines the British Army and marks it out as quite unique, certainly when compared to the French, German, and even to an extent the Russian army, although the Russians did have combat experience from the Russia-Japanese War, is that virtually all the senior commanders of the BEF that went to war in 1914 had earned their stripes in South Africa. Some of them had actually come away with quite serious wounds. Archie Murray, the Chief of Staff, may still have had a bullet lodged in his stomach by the time he went to war in 1914. So John French had really made his name in South Africa, so had Douglas Hague, so had Horace Smith-Dorrien, so had Edmund Allenby. And we can extrapolate this to staff officers as well. David Henderson, who commanded the RFC, had caught the eye in South Africa, as had Archie Murray and, to an extent, Henry Wilson. Indeed, of the BEF, there's 6 BEF infantry divisional commanders that went to war in 1914. Only 3 had not served in South Africa, and the remaining 3, they all had colonial experience in other conflicts. These were highly experienced soldiers who'd seen war at the sharp end, and they thought seriously about their profession. There's an image, it's a seductive one, that the officer class, the Edwardian officer class, was mainly interested in sporting pursuits. They like their fox hunting, they like their horse riding, they like their polo. This is all true, but as other authors have pointed out, to condemn an entire group because of their social habits is actually erroneous. The fact that officers often focused a lot of their time a lot of their discussion in their memoirs and their diaries were often focused on their social events is not in itself anomalous. Not many people go home and write endlessly about what they did at work that day. In actual fact, if you dig under the surface of what the British Army officers of this era were doing, they were thinking seriously about their profession. Douglas Hague was perhaps the most forward-thinking in some ways of the cavalry officers of this era, writing his book Cavalry Studies. Horace Smith-Dorrien did not write a book, but he certainly produced voluminous literature in the form of training memorandums. And interestingly, both these commanders, during their tenure at Aldershot, encouraged junior officers, particularly brigadiers, to produce tactical thinking of their own. This was a thinking army. It reflected on what had happened, and it thought about what might happen in the future. They thought seriously about their professions. But that is not the same as planning for a future war. Something that's quite absent, really, from the thinking of the senior figures of the BF is what the war is going to look like, even who they're going to fight. There's a wide expectation that they will run into the Germans. Hague makes himself something of an expert on the German military. James Grierson, who unfortunately dies just before the campaign begins in 1914, multilingual and is considered the British expert on German tactics. They consider the German army, they consider German tactics, but what the British Army does not do in terms of planning is really consider where they may end up fighting the German army. That's a genuine criticism. One thing that comes out, and it goes back to the Swiss army knife issue again, is that the army wants to be flexible. It's no use preparing straining every sinew of the army to fight the Germans if then suddenly Britain has to fight Russia in Afghanistan, or suddenly the army has to go back to South Africa and fight the Boers again, or suddenly there's a major problem in Afghanistan itself, a major uprising, and there's a war there. The army needs to be flexible, and because there's an expectation that a single component of the BEF, perhaps a division, perhaps a corps, may deploy separately, there's a desire for each division to be capable of conducting its own campaign. And so diversity of method is a result, and it's actually encouraged. In 1912, at the Army Manoeuvres, it's observed that the different army divisions actually have different methods of doing things. The Inspector General of Forces complains and says that this is dangerous. He's knocked back by the Army Council that says, no, it's actually completely desirable that our divisions have their own methods of doing things. We do not want the army to be stereotyped into one type of fighting that may not be appropriate for everybody. And the Army Council's actual solution to the problem of diversity is Sir John French. They comment rather blithely that when the army does if the army does go to war as its full fighting force, then Sir John French and GHQ will simply impose authority upon it. Unfortunately, as we know, in 1914 this doesn't work out quite as planned, and when you've got fairly independently minded people trying to work together, it's very difficult to keep them under control. And indeed, although they were highly experienced professionals, they were also, in the words of Beauvoir de Lisle, the cavalry commander in 1914, a brigadier general, the man who launched the charge at Ordrenez in August 1914, later went on to command a corps on the Western Front. These were men of marked personality. They were people who had big opinions and, in some cases, enormous tempers. Horace Smith-Dorrien considered the worst in the army. Edmund Allenby ran him a close second. These were men who, if they fell out with one another, formed damagingly negative relationships. In 1913, Sir John French and Horace Smith-Dorrien were simply not on speaking terms as a result of a major fallout over cavalry training in 1909. You can see there's a potentially dangerous weakness there. An army that encourages diversity and flexibility, that is given to a degree of cliquiness, a degree of feuding, and suddenly expecting an officer, Sir John French, who certainly had an excess of personality himself, to impose unity on them, posed something of a weakness. But the great leveller for the British Army, whatever its weaknesses of senior command in 1913 and into 1940, was in many ways levelled out by the quality of its junior officers. And these were the real backbone and the real strength of the British Army in 13 and in 1914. Certainly at battalion level, and to a large extent down at company level, so we're talking colonel down to captain really, there was a vast pool of combat experience again. Most of these junior officers had cut their teeth in the Boer War in some way, shape or form. And while not all of them had actually seen full-scale action in the Boer War, they'd nevertheless had the experience of being in a war zone, of fighting, of being on campaign, of having the risk of danger, death, problems of supply, and so on. They'd seen the elephant, to use the American phrase, and they knew to an extent what war looked like, and they knew they could conduct themselves under at least some of the pressures of war. Obviously, 1914 would prove very different to 1902, but nevertheless, that experience was really irreplaceable, and certainly it made the army unique. There was no comparable level of junior officer experience in the French and German armies, for example. The British Army as an institution recognised the quality of its junior officers, and it made them the linchpin, really, of British Army tactics. Starting in 1902, being solidified in 1905, and finally codified in 1909, was the authority of the man on the spot for the British Army. The idea that an officer on the ground could directly disobey an order from a senior officer if the junior officer had good reason to believe the senior officer was not fully aware of the situation on the ground. Effectively, a great delegation of authority to the junior officer. There was also the issue that the British Army was encouraged to give orders that were broad in scope and stated an overall objective, but left specific methods to the junior officer to carry out. Now, when the German army does this in 1944 and 1940, it's much lauded and praised. When the British Army does this in 1914, it's criticised for being an umpiring institution in which clear orders are not given. In actual fact, in 1914, this delegated approach to junior officers is essential to the Army's success, and indeed perhaps its survival. Yes, there are mistakes inevitably, but overall the balance sheet is very much in favour of the junior officer. And this belief in the overall ability of captains, colonels, majors and so forth feeds into peacetime training, and it results, again, in a certain degree of differing tactics. If you're a colonel of a battalion in 1913, depending on where you're stationed, if you're outside of Aldershot, then you've got a great degree of leeway on how you train your battalion. Now, this can sometimes backfire, and there are one or two examples of quite idiosyncratic tactics appearing. In 1910, a battalion that unfortunately I've not been able to identify by name is brought up by the Inspector General of Forces because it started to use volley fire again in its training, and this is obviously causing concern, and it actually prompted an Army Council intervention. But such incidents as that are fairly rare. As far as I can determine, the actual quality of battalion training is high, but it comes with differing tactics. And as later, in early 1913, there's some discussion amongst the general staff noting that battalions have got subtle ways of doing things differently, which can actually be potentially dangerous. For example, it's noted in one brigade there is different signals between the battalions to advance. Now, obviously, in the heat of battle, that can prove problematic. There's some concern, but little is done because, again, the idea is put forward, it's better to be flexible than regimented. There's been some criticism, again, mainly coming from Tim Travers, that particularly the battalion officers of the BF are not really up to scratch, that they are old-fashioned, that they owe their appointments to cronyism, nepotism and so on. It's not true. Yes, as in any institution, you can find officers who probably should not have gone to war in 1914 and perhaps should have been rooted out in 1913. But they're the exception rather than the rule. And indeed what comes out from a study of the papers, for example, Brigadier's papers, is that the one thing that most brigadiers hate is the phrase eyewash, making your battalion look extremely smart but not particularly militarily efficient. Where incompetence is uncovered, it's usually rooted out fairly vigorously. There are exceptions. There are some battalion commanders who probably shouldn't have gone to war. Mainwaring, for example, who surrendered at St Quentin in August, probably should not have gone to war due to his ill health. But generally, the battalion commanders and below are a pretty competent, tough bunch, but they do have the differing tactics. Now, to go back to the lions led by donkeys quote I began with, the old Contemptibles, the men of the British Army, perhaps we should call them the young Contemptibles in 1913, much lauded as these tough, hardened professionals. In actual fact, the army that went to war in 1914 included quite a large proportion of reservists who had not been full-time soldiers for some time. But beyond that, the men that the army recruited in 1913 were of a substantially lower calibre in physical and mental terms than the recruits that would come pouring in at the start of the First World War. A constant complaint of the British Army is that it had to recruit from the poorest sections of society. And the phrase, it's the army or the workhouse, was roughly analogous to between the devil and the deep blue sea, as a phrase, certainly in the Midlands in 1913. It was estimated by various army medical officers that about 50% or more of the incoming recruits in 1913 were of below average mental and physical capability. Quite often these were malnourished people with no educational capabilities, no trade. Sometimes they were forced to join the army simply because there was nowhere else for them to go. Now, this had always been a problem for the British Army. Wellington's famous phrase that his army was the scum of the earth still carried certain echoes in 1913. And up to the Boer War, the British Army had solved this problem with rigorous drill. They had assumed that their men were not really capable of doing anything apart from following orders, that if they were bullied around, pushed around, very hard drill, they would do that relatively competently. But the Boer War had shown you needed a lot more than that. In the Boer War, the Boers proved unfortunately skilled at shooting down officers. And then once the officers were down, they'd shoot down the NCOs. And once that had happened, as one survivor of the Battle of Spion-Kop related, the men milled about helplessly like a flock of frightened sheep. And this happened a lot. The actual British official phrase for when this occurred in the Boer War was the men became disorientated, which effectively meant they turned and they were going in the wrong direction. And it was discovered that the loss of officers and the loss of NCOs was absolutely fatal to the effectiveness of a fighting battalion. And so the men had to be trained a bit more than just simply being drilled. And this was especially true because modern battles meant that the units would be widely extended. You couldn't have column or line formations anymore. You had to be scattered across the battlefield. And if your men had to wait for the officer to tell them what to do all the time, this was not going to result in a very effective fighting force. Instead, the army came up with a phrase. It was actually borrowed from Leo Amery, who was a journalist at the time, later a politician, of course, that what the army needed was discipline on the higher plane. And this idea was grabbed by a number of officers. Most prominent and most senior amongst them was Ian Hamilton, later commanding the Dardanelles. What this encapsulated was it wasn't enough to simply browbeat and bully your soldiers and drill them into mindless obedience. Instead, there was an element of that, so they would follow discipline, but you had to instill in them a degree of confidence. You had to make them confident in their own abilities, confident in their weapons, and confident in the men around them, not just the officers. Yes, they would still be expected to, unquestioningly follow orders from officers or NCOs, but they'd also be expected to make decisions themselves, such as which piece of terrain to hide behind, which target to pick out, where to move, and generally to be able to conduct themselves on the battlefield in a much better way. This was controversial stuff in 1902, but it had become standard practice by 1913, because to the surprise of some of the more conservative minds in the army, they found that when men were given a certain degree of responsibility, and we can overemphasise this was hardly delegation of command in 1913, but when they were given a certain degree of responsibility, the best men responded very positively. And they would react well, they would improve themselves, they would take pride in being a soldier, and they would seek to advance their army career. And it worked. Even those who perhaps didn't respond very well to being given responsibility could then look to their comrades who had done so. And the whole system worked. And the army was rather proud of it and rather easily forgot that there were many within the military that had opposed it in 1902. Training consisted really of two key elements. Marksmanship was absolutely the key element of British infantry training up to 1914. Before the Boer War, an individual soldier had 42 live rounds of ammunition to fire per year in practice. After the Boer War, he was given 300 rounds of live ammunition per year to fire in practice. It was later reduced to 250, but nevertheless, this was still a far higher proportion than was available to French, German, or even Indian army units. And the obsession with marksmanship actually really did take hold within the British Army. Individual soldiers were encouraged to become good marksmen. They were rewarded with additional pay, marksmanship badges. Companies were rewarded if they achieved certain skills. And different battalions had an unofficial reward system. For example, the 1st Cheshires were widely rumoured to have a beer-based reward system for soldiers who hit their correct targets. And this was both resented, but also, subtly copied by several other battalions in the British Army. And indeed, pride and rivalry about who was the best shooting unit really did take hold. One of my favourite instances concerned the 20th Hussars, because the cavalry was trained to the same level of shooting as the infantry. When Squadron C of the 20th Hussars went on the range, because they were going last, obviously in the alphabetical order, some wag had scrawled down the wall, Haldane diddled, or how Squadron C earns their marksmanship pay. It caused such a stink that there was some actual rumour that there had been brawls in the barracks between Squadron C and Squadron B members, and it resulted in this very fierce rivalry between the two that made it into the regimental history years later. That was how serious the British Army took its marksmanship. It also emphasised fieldcraft, which is just the simple basics of how you conduct yourself in the field. There's been a major problem in the Boer War because troops simply weren't told what to do. They were expected to just follow an officer's orders when they got out there. didn't happen in practice. Instead, they were trained within limits to know what to do, to know how to read the ground to an extent, to use the ground, to construct basic trenches and other such issues. And all contributed to a British infantryman who was probably the best trained, man for man, in Europe at the time. But I alluded earlier to this, there was one big drawback. The army recruited from the poorest in society and it could never get enough of them. The biggest problem that the British battalions faced in 1913 and 14 was that they were all under strength to a greater or lesser degree. Only the most popular battalions were able to maintain anything near full strength, and some of the less popular battalions could be as much as 75% under strength. There were two reasons for this. The first was simply the army was generally not considered an attractive career move. It tended to attract the desperate or the adventurous, or sometimes a combination of the two. The second problem was that the army was required to send out drafts of trained men to supplement the garrison in India. And so there was a constant process of unfortunate wastage, that the best trained and fittest men would be sent away to join the Indian battalion, and the army, home battalion, would have to start again with new recruits. It was noted as being discouraging to the men, discouraging to the officers, and hardly encouraging to recruitment. And so the army was always dependent on a reservist system. But what of its overall tactics and training? Well, I don't want to bore you too much with this, and at risk of sounding like a mercenary, I'll say read the book if you're interested. But I can summarise it thusly. It was drawn from practical Boer War experience. Some authors have criticised this and said, well, the Boer War was nothing like the First World War. Well, that's true, but no war is like a war that follows after it. Every war is unique and every war is different. And what the British Army was good at between the Boer War and the First World War was taking what was universal, or what they felt was going to be universally useful, and putting it into practical tactics. There were certain things that occurred in the Boer War that were unlikely to occur in any other conflict, particularly a European conflict. The army generally discarded these, and instead it focused on things that would be useful for whenever it fought an opponent who had modern weapons. This goes back to the idea that the army was always being prepared for the most formidable opponent it might face. And its tactics were practical, and certainly as far as the infantry went, they were based on fire, movement and concealment. All of these had been key lessons from the Boer War, particularly the fact that you couldn't move unless you had suppressing fire, and if you were concealed from the enemy, the effectiveness of your fire was doubled, if not trebled. Wandering blindly into ambushes was extremely detrimental to a battalion's morale, not to mention the health of the soldiers. And so the army focused especially on concealment, and actually some of the reports on concealment training from Aldershot in 1913 are remarkable for their stringency. In some cases, people are criticised because some of the leaves they've used to conceal their position are turning brown and will be observed by the enemy. Various other things. Somebody had used some pine cuttings to cover an entrenchment. It was argued that this wasn't very good because the pine entrenchments were quite green and there was a degree of that could be noticed against the grass. This was how seriously the British Army took concealment and these kind of practical lessons it had learned from the Boer War. There was none of the pantalon rouge that the French Army endorsed in the British Army of 1913. And indeed, French Army observers in 1913 commented somewhat nervously that the British infantry was clearly a step above that of the French, that the British took cover with skill, disappeared into the ground, advanced by rushes, always fired from prone, and generally conducted themselves in a much more flexible and apparently skillful way than many comparable French battalions. But there were limitations. We've already touched on one of these, but it's worth reiterating again and how it influenced training. And this was shortage of men. I've already told you that the battalions were always short of recruits. This influenced training. A battalion at full strength could expect to muster about 1,000 officers and men. In actual physical training, they rarely were able to get more than about 500 men, perhaps 600 in popular battalions, into the field for battalion-level training exercises. And this was seriously problematic, especially prior to 1913, when the army was using the 8-company battalion, effectively 8 companies of about 100 men each. It meant that some companies were so starved of men that they were not a command, and the officers in charge learnt little from them. The men in charge treated it as a game. It didn't work. And so what the army had been doing, certainly from 1905 onwards, was combining companies and going from an 8-company organisation to a 4-company organisation for training. And this was largely so that there would be enough men per company that there would be some kind of command worth the name. In October 1913, the army officially adopted a 4-company battalion system. It was very much in line with other European armies. There were long and generally positive arguments in its favour, but it also was partially influenced by the need to have a company worth commanding on battalion training. And this shortage of men meant that the army tended to focus on company-level training more so than battalion level. Because it was difficult to get a full-size battalion into the field unless you padded it with various units and so on, there was an emphasis on company training because you could get enough men to run a company, but run a battalion was difficult. There was also, and on a larger scale, there was inconsistent inter-arm training. It was, apart from at Aldershot where there was a multi-arm command, it was often difficult, and we've already heard about the problems with the territorial force artillery training. Similar problems exist in the regular army. It was difficult to get a mixture of cavalry, artillery and infantry into a training area for manoeuvres or practice at one single time and have enough time for them to actually do anything worthwhile. The other issue, of course, was how infantry and artillery would combine. It was an issue that all armies grappled with, and the British Army grappled with in particular. The two arms had grown apart in the pre-1913 years, and the Army Council had actually approved a fairly positive sounding policy. The infantry officers would be sent to artillery batteries and artillery officers sent to infantry battalions, so they could get a feel for how they worked and learn various things about each other. Army Council fully approved this. A year later, the report came back saying, well, this is open and we're asking for volunteers and nobody's volunteering. And the Army actually had to start ordering officers to go on attachment and join the infantry or artillery or vice versa. And there was actually some bad feeling in some cases, or it resulted in some bad feeling. On manoeuvres, the infantry was frequently heard to complain that the artillery wasn't doing enough to support them, whereas the artillery, by the very nature of manoeuvres, couldn't really make its effects seen. You can't fire live ammunition on manoeuvres. It could hide at the back or station itself at the back and fire lots of smoke powder to make it look like it was doing something. But the infantry often felt like it wasn't being properly supported. And this was a psychological issue as much as anything because it couldn't see the bursting shells. It couldn't perceive what the artillery would be doing. And it meant that the two arms were rather apart. The infantry expected the artillery to support it, and the artillery wanted to support the infantry, but neither infantry or artillery was entirely sure how best that support could be ensured. And that would go on to be a problem in 1914. And large-scale manoeuvres were generally limited in the pre-war army. This was a combination of lack of budget. These were expensive, as we already heard from the TF's manoeuvres. They were equally expensive for the army. It also required a large amount of space. And quite often, the ground over which the manoeuvre was taking place would receive a certain amount of damage, shall we say. People digging holes in it, or during manoeuvres in 1904, soldiers dismantling gates and fences to use them for firewood, which was not well received by the local landowner. And in fact, in places, the land was only rented to the army or handed over to the army for manoeuvres on the ground that the ground itself would not be broken. And this led to a ridiculous situation at some practice camps where you were not allowed to dig any kind of entrenchment. Instead, you had to lay down a big piece of sheet to say, well, we are now entrenched, and the soldier would lie on top of it and go, we are entrenched. And this was, of course, utterly ridiculous and led to all kinds of ribaldry and problems. It also meant that large-scale manoeuvres were a fairly new concept to the British Army, and it took time for them to adapt. There were various problems of command. Sir John French's performance wasn't great in pre-war manoeuvres, but in truth, apart from Grierson, who came out with some greater credit, nobody's performance was especially spectacular in pre-war manoeuvres. Some people have seized on this and said this is evidence of military inefficiency. In actual fact, manoeuvres are almost designed to find problems. If everything goes spectacularly well on manoeuvres, they haven't done their job properly. They're there to expose the problems, and then you're supposed to address them afterwards. So we can read too much into the difficulties the British Army has on manoeuvres, and it certainly thinks a lot about what it has to learn from its experiences. Of course, the war comes along before perhaps it's absorbed all the lessons it should have done. It's worth saying a few words about equipment, because as you've seen, the territorial force had to make do with an earlier generation of weapons, the long lead, the 15-pounder and so on. The BF in 1914, in weapon terms, was generally quite well equipped, but its equipment was shaped by two factors, which we keep coming back to. The first is that Swiss Army knife role of the army, the fact that it's a small army that can go anywhere and potentially fight anybody. Now, while heavy artillery, very useful if you're fighting Boers, Germans or Russians, heavy artillery is fairly useless if you're fighting on the northwest frontier. You're simply not going to be able to get it up the mountain passes. Similarly, lots of machine guns, great if you're fighting perhaps Zulus or Mahdists or fighting a modern opponent, but not much use if you're trekking through the jungles of Burma and you've got an ammunition train stretched out half a mile behind you. And these are serious considerations that the army really wants to try and get as much equipment that's universally useful as it can. And this does preclude against certain heavy equipment that the army thinks it might like, but realises it may never find a use for. Remember that war is not inevitable in 1913 as far as the British Army is concerned. It may never have to fight a European opponent. Its next big campaign could be in Afghanistan or India or Burma or anywhere. And so it's got to try and arm itself for all eventualities. The second issue is that the army is limited by its budget. Haldane's greatest achievement is that he manages to create a more efficient army while at the same time keeping it on an extremely tight budgetary leash. But there's no particular room for financial expansion there. And that does preclude the army from getting some of the weapons that it would like. In 1913, it would quite like a replacement for the 18-pounder artillery piece. It would like something that's more like the French 75. It's not going to get it. It would quite like more machine guns of a lighter design, but it's not going to get it, partially because of budget, but also because of the size and role. And most interestingly of all, there's proposals that the School of Musketry keep coming out that the British Army should adopt a semi-automatic rifle on the grounds that the Army's already very good at marksmanship, it can already fire fast. If it has a semi-automatic rifle, it will fire 10 times as quickly. All these proposals are knocked back primarily because of reasons of budget. The Army has to choose what it has and when it has it, and it's forced to make some difficult decisions. What is weak about the BEF is that frontline battalions are pretty well equipped. The Shortley Enfield's a great rifle, the 18-pounder is a solid gun, the 60-pounder, the heavy piece, very good gun. The 4.5-inch howitzer is probably the best howitzer in its class, the best field howitzer in its class. Packs and equipment, there's room for improvement, but they're generally solid. But there's very, very little ability to replace large-scale losses, or if losses come quickly. And this extends even to ammunition. British expectations for ammunition consumption are very much on the low side. And this proves a problem. Under the Great Retreat in 1914, some artillery batteries are firing, or one artillery battery fires in a single day. I think it is on the 24th of August. It fires more ammunition than the battery had fired during the entire Boer War on a single day. And so the ammunition scales that the Army is using are soon found out of date. And its ability to replace lost, broken or damaged equipment is seriously constrained. It takes time to do that. There's very little room for expansion in British production. And that goes on to become a problem in 1914. But again, before we criticise too much about why this is the case, consider the size and role of the Army and the fact it's always operating under this large budget. If you're in the Army, you can't simply go to the British government and say, right, we need 50 or 100 reserve machine guns just in case there's a major war and we lose most of our machine gun complement. The government is not going to buy that. So, some conclusions, and I'm very pleased to report I'm well ahead of time, ahead of the curve. 3 points I'd like you to take away, really, from this talk. And we'll leave the Swiss Army knife comparison aside. The British Army in 1913 was really, as I say, it's equipped to fight the most formidable opponent it thinks it might run into. And that's either going to be a big, formidable colonial war, probably the Boers, possibly the Afghans, possibly the Afridi, or a short war against a European opponent, either the Russians or the Germans, or very, very, very possibly the Ottomans in Egypt. And I'm classing them as a European opponent because of their equipment and organisation. That's what the army is capable of doing. And when you think about it, there's no particular reason why the British Army would need to be prepared to fight a very long European war unless war is truly becoming inevitable. And given the constraints of budget and so on, it's perhaps fair that the British Army focused on these roles. But the fact that it was this flexible army, the fact that it did have to consider so many opponents, that it had to be balanced between colonial demands and European demands, meant that while it could fight both, and indeed its performance in 1914 shows that it was capable of fighting European war, it probably wasn't ideally suited to either. It was probably too heavily armed and too thoroughly trained for most colonial emergencies. Even a Third Boer War was unlikely to really test the army's tactical capacity. But it was probably a little bit too small and a little bit too fragile for a very serious European war. And so it's caught between the two. As with most hybrids, a specialist force usually has the advantage. But nevertheless, as the army shows in 1914, it's certainly capable of putting up a good fight. And that's the point I'd really like to end on, that despite these limitations, despite the fact that it had a wider variety of duties than any of its contemporary armies, and the fact that it was constantly short of money, frequently short of men, the regular British Army was judged as a formidable force. And not merely by itself, by its own estimation, the British Army felt it was good, but also foreign observers admired it. The French, what we've already discussed, were quite impressed with it in 1913. And the German army, despite the Kaiser's possibly apocryphal statement that it was a contemptible little army, in tactical terms, the Germans actually rated the British Army quite highly. And it's interesting that in 1914, the Germans frequently attribute British skill to the fact that the British are colonial soldiers and they are all highly experienced men. As I've hopefully shown you, the British Army's men were often far from highly experienced, tough colonial soldiers. They're often drawn from the poorest elements of society, but they were certainly trained to a very high standard, and one that the Germans and the French came to admire. And so in 1913, the army sort of stands almost ready for action. In some ways, it's at its best position relative to how it will be a year later, when it has been rocked by the Curragh Mutiny, which damages its command relationships still further. We've already seen the fact that these are men of marked personality who easily form feuds. But the groundwork for the success of the BF in battle in 1914 has already been laid by 1913. From 1913 onwards, it's a process of refinement. And yes, while weaknesses still exist, I would argue that the strengths of the BF, which are apparent in 1913, outweigh its weaknesses. Thank you very much.
Marry me and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, let us swear. It's a long, long way to Tipperary.